set up here. Welcome to another episode of Non-Fundamentalist Bible Studies from the Living and Living podcast, and we are retranslating James. This is part 4. We are on the end of chapter 3 and the beginning of chapter 4. If you haven't listened to the other ones, that might help you understand this one. So make sure you go hop into those. They're on YouTube and they're on the other podcast. These are my sermon notes that I'm redoing for like podcast form, because I know some folks are really looking for Bible studies that are not so fundamentalist, that are not so harsh, that are not they don't have that weaponized religious language to them. But it's really hard to read an epistle and not feel like it has this weaponized language to it, because so much of our evangelical understanding of the Bible is a weaponization of, we have the truth, they don't, they need it, so let's go give it to them. And that becomes very violent. That's kind of a natural weakness of the evangelical church. So if you're on the outside of that, but you still have a curiosity about the Bible and what it is meaning in context, this is for you. Now, I'm retranslating the passages from the Greek. That does not mean that I'm a Greek scholar. It just means that I've had some classes, I've had some education, and I've got a lot of tools and some imagination. And I'm retranslating it not to give another version of the Bible for everyone to read, but more of like to reimagine what it might sound like if James was writing to us today. Kind of like what Eugene Peterson did with The Message, but definitely not as brilliant as that guy, because he's one of my heroes. So that's what we're doing here, and this is the fourth time through. This is the fourth chapter. So we're going to do the end of chapter 3, beginning of chapter 4. I follow the liturgical calendar, so that's why we jump around. I'm not doing every single verse. But before, I got to tell you a story before we dive into James. On November 19th in 1863, a U.S. senator and renowned orator named Edward Everett gave a 2-hour, very dramatic speech in a graveyard in Pennsylvania to honor the fallen soldiers of the Civil War. And it was totally forgotten because the person who came after him was better. I'll just say that it was better. So Edward Everett gave a 2-hour, 13,607 word speech. And he was really known for that. But he was overshadowed by humility, because the person who came after him was the President of the United States of America, Abraham Lincoln. And he did a short little dedication of 271 words that later became known as the Gettysburg Address. Now, if you look on the actual handout, the flyer that was being handed out, Edward Everett was the one to give the Gettysburg Address, and Abraham Lincoln was the one to dedicate the place. But we don't call the address that Edward Everett gave, the Gettysburg Address. We call the dedication that Abraham Lincoln did the address, because it was so clear, it was powerful, and it was short and to the point. It's known as the Gettysburg Address, and it was simple and clear, and we remember it. We don't remember the big grand oration. Now, I tell that because the passage today is warning people about the people who can come into your synagogue, because these are Jewish Messianic believers, very early, like 45 to 60-ish, somewhere in there. People would come into these places with grand speeches and fancy clothes and rings on their fingers, and everyone would just be enamored by what they said and what they looked like, without actually asking the questions, I wonder who this person is. And so that's kind of where James wants to take us. And he asks the question right off the bat in verse 13 of chapter 3, who is wise and knowledgeable among you? Not to challenge them about, do you think yourself wise? But who do you think is wise and knowledgeable? So it's not to get you to question whether you think you are wise and knowledgeable, like how I would probably read this in my former fundamentalist days, but who is it that you think is wise and knowledgeable? Almost like he's asking the question, who's capturing your attention and then directing your perceptions and your values? That's a very important question that he's asking here. Who is capturing your attention and directing your perception and values? Because those people with the grand speeches and those people with the fancy clothes and the rings on their fingers and positions of power and wealth to back it up, they can look fancy, talk fancy, but do they have wisdom and knowledge, is what he's asking. Are you sure they have wisdom and knowledge? And the word for wise there is where we get our word philosopher. And a philosopher is someone who asks the big questions to try and search for things. And then knowledgeable is the term where we get our term epistemology, where it's a study of how do you know the knowledge you're accumulating to make like these judgment calls on what is a good life and what you should do with your life, and the knowledge that you've accumulated. How do you know that that knowledge is actually like good? Has it been fact checked? Has it been looked up? Who do you think is wise and holds knowledge among you? Who's the philosophers? That's the question, he says. And then James like answers his question, not with, well, it's obviously the people with the power and the wealth and the positions and the fancy clothes and the big talkers. No, he says they're going to have to prove it. He says this, show by your good life that your works are done with gentleness born of wisdom. So he basically just says you got to prove it. If you want these positions that are looked to as being wise and knowledgeable, here's what you got to show. You have to show by your good life that your works are done with gentleness born of wisdom. So he's basically saying, let me see it. Don't tell me about it. I got to see it in the repeated patterns of your living. Show by your good life. And the word good there is actually the Greek word for beautiful, which I really like that. It's not the word agathos, which means good. It's the word kalos, which means beautiful. Show by your beautiful manner of living. So the word life there is not bios or zoe, which is it's the word that means your behavior. Not just moralistic actions, but your MO, how you carry yourself. The repeated, consistent deeds done, the accumulated work of your life. So he says, if you want to be considered a wise person who's knowledgeable amongst people and have that kind of influence that directs perception and values of a community of people, you need to have a track record of a beautiful life, the accumulated work of your life. It has to be beautiful, and then he says it needs to be done in gentleness and wisdom. And the word gentleness there is the word meek, which means quiet power. Not a brash, loud, arrogant, impressive, even persuasive. No, he says quiet power. Meekness is quiet power with a mild disposition. So he's saying that Christians should look for authoritative guidance in those who have a track record of a quiet, steadfast power displayed in gentleness. Ooh, okay. Well, that's pretty good. And then he kind of flips it back over and says, but if you got all this in your track record, if this is the deeds done, accumulated by your life, out the door. You're not going to have these positions of influence here. Because James is in charge of all these communities. He's kind of like the bishop of it. He says, if you have bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, don't be arrogant and lie about the truth. Now, this is really interesting wording here because there's a lot of moralistic language, bitter envy, selfish ambition. Those are moralistic terms, but in the day, they take the morals off of them. The word for bitter envy is actually just harsh zeal. And you've probably met someone zealous before who, started a new fad diet or a new exercise program, and now everyone in the entire universe has to do this too. And they're like trying to convert you over to their new thing. I've been there. You've been there. And you've received something from that. That's harsh zeal. I was like, oh, you're such an idiot. I can't believe you don't know about this new thing that is going to fix everything for everyone of all time. That's harsh zeal. So if you have that harsh zealousness in there and paired that with selfish ambition, the word selfish ambition is literally trying to win a bid for a job. Like I want to do the masonry of this building, and I am going to talk myself up and give my resume in there and put my, that's the word. So we put a moralistic term, selfish, on it, but it's really just selling yourself, which there's nothing wrong with selling yourself if you're a salesperson, if you have, good intentions behind your sales and all that, you're not manipulative and all that. So it's not putting a moralistic thing on it, but it's harsh zeal paired up with bitter, selfish ambition, which another term that's used for is running for office. That's just really interesting there. So you don't need to talk yourself up to get to these positions of wisdom and knowledge. You need to have a track record of a beautiful life. That's what he's trying to get at here. So if you're a salesperson, I'm not talking about you so much, or even a politician, I'm talking about you. But if you are trying to get to positions of knowledge and wisdom with fancy talk and all this other stuff, he's like, don't just talk about the truth. Don't just talk above the truth with your... so he's saying you need to prove by your accumulated life. Don't mask over your life, your accumulated life. Don't mask over it with bragging. So don't be arrogant and lie about the truth. A better rephrasing of that would be, the word there is brag over and the cover over objective reality. So don't put the word there is pseudomai, and it means to put a facade on top of. So like if you have a drywalled wall and you want to make it look like a brick wall, you can put a facade over it. It doesn't mean it's actually a masoned wall. It just looks like it is. So he's saying don't do that with your life. That if you're trying to reach these positions of wisdom and knowledge so that you can influence a community's perceptions and values with just your fancy talk and positions and power and wealth and money, what you're doing is you're bragging over, you're covering over with your words and fancy talk the accumulated work of the life that you actually have lived. And James is saying it's not about the positions you hold and the power that you have accumulated and all that. If you want to be wise and knowledgeable and guide a community towards perception and value, you need to have a track record of a beautiful, wonderful life. And he says if you're trying to reach it through this fancy talk, envy and ambition and arrogance and covering over the truth, if that's your way, he says that's the wisdom that doesn't come down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, and devilish. Now, if you're traveling in your mind to like the 1970s movie The Exorcist, you're going the wrong direction. That's just something that we have done with this. When he's talking about this way of being in the world is earthly, unspiritual, and devilish, he's talking about something that's animalistic and base and barbaric, brutish, and those are the words for earthly, not just of the earth because God loves the earth, but like the base, like when you don't have the other person's needs in mind and you're just going to get and you don't care about the other person, that's an animalistic desire that's absent of human compassion. So he's saying that's earthly, and then unspiritual means brutish, like the spiritual enlightened part of us. If we're not operating from that part, then we're operating from like this barbaric place. So they kind of go hand in hand, earthly, unspiritual. And then the word devilish there is the word demonic, and it doesn't mean like Frank Peretti and Exorcist and all that kind of stuff. It means a malevolent, cancerous collective thinking. Now I'll break that down real quick. Malevolent, out for the bad of something. Cancerous, wanting that bad to spread and to the detriment of everything around it. Collective means not just me and my individual brain, but now the group think that we are all involved in. It's malevolent, cancerous, collective thinking. He says where that stuff is, where there's envy and that selfish ambition, there's also going to be disorder and wickedness of every kind. Now this is really fascinating. The word disorder there is confused instability, and then the word every kind of wickedness is the word for pragmatic, cheap tricks, or as AC/DC said, dirty deeds done dirt cheap. It's like dollar store quality items, dollar store quality character. Every kind of pragmatism is like, well, this will work. We'll just do this. It's pragmatic. It might get the job done, but you're doing it at the expense of all this stuff. There's no quality behind it. It's not built on the foundation of a beautiful life. You're just going to say this to get this thing done, or you're going to do this to do that thing and get it done. So it's like a pragmatic thing is so pragmatic that it turns into it turns into something cheap and bad and I would dare say wicked, evil. Pragmatic, well, it's going to work, it's going to get the job done kind of a thing. So that's the kind of wisdom that doesn't come from above. And then he talks about the kind of wisdom that does come from above. He says it's pure, peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality or hypocrisy. So that list, that's a good list. He's like Paul, he's likes list. The word pure means it's unpolluted. Your mind and your heart and your intentions are not polluted, but they're pure. They're good. The word peaceable means peace-loving, which is the antithesis not of conflict, but of domination. Because the word peace there, the Greek is going to be eirene, which the Hebrew version of that would be shalom, which means everything living in harmony as it was meant to. And when everything's living in harmony as it meant to, nobody can be the dominating thing of that. So you can't be dominating and be at peace. They can't occupy the same space because one is against it. And so it has to be peaceable or peace-loving, which means non-dominating, but living in harmony with the things around you. And it's also gentle, which means equitable and fair and giving everyone a shot around you. And the word willing to yield or yielding means that you're persuadable. You don't have all the answers and all the truth. And now you got to go and dispense all this truth and convince everyone. But it's persuadable. You are persuadable. Like with more information coming in, you know, with a humility that you don't have it all figured out. Without partiality means you're non-judgmental, and free of hypocrisy means that it is authentic in its core. It's coming from a good, authentic place of deep within who you are. And then he goes on to say, the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace, which is a mouthful. But the word for righteousness is not moralistic actions, but more actions that bring about the justice of God, because the word righteousness and justice are interchangeable in both Greek and Hebrew. I said that before, and it's just one of those things I'll keep saying forever and ever. They're not moralistic, pietistic actions, but works that bring about the justice of God. And those, the fruit of righteousness, so the justice coming about around us comes when we sow harmony and peace and shalom by those who, quote, make peace. And the word make is the word poiema, which is the Greek word for poet. So it's someone who can take a spark of creativity within them and do something beautiful with it. And so it says the people who make justice in the world are those who are most creative. They get a spark and intuition about how things ought to be. And then they poetically craft it into something that makes peace. So the retranslation is this: who is it that captures your attention and trust? Let them prove it with a life that is consistently beautiful, that has a quiet authority, displayed in a mild disposition, not those who are loudly passionate in words, vying for our favor, cloaking objective reality with grand talk. That's not elevated wisdom, but cheap pragmatism that produces chaotic, divisive instability among us. True wisdom is first and foremost not polluted by such cheap pragmatism. It loves uniting us for a common good, is open to listen and learn, and full of a non-judgmental compassion for the afflicted. And finally, does all of this with authenticity, because justice is planted through nonviolent poets of peace. Good thing that describes all the Christians out there right now, doesn't it? Okay, that was facetious. In chapter 4, he goes on to say those conflicts and disputes among you, where do they come from? Aren't they coming from the cravings that are at war within you? And the conflicts and disputes is actual military terminology for wars and battles. Saying these wars and battles, where are they coming from? But your cravings that are at war within you. And the word for cravings, we got our word hedonism from that Greek word. And your hedonistic desires are desires for power and position and pleasure at the expense of another person. So where do these conflicts and disputes come from among you in your community, in your people, in your nation, in your town, in your whatever? They come from your hedonistic desires for power, position, and pleasure. Okay, I think I'm tracking here. And he goes on to say, you want something and you don't have it, so you commit murder. And you covet something and you cannot obtain it, so you engage in disputes and conflicts. You don't have because you do not ask. Now, some translations add the word God there, but if you actually look at the context of this, this is not about prayer. This is about how to live in harmony with one another. So if that's true, the source of our wars, our conflicts, our battles are actually from our inner war with ourselves, for the lust of things that we don't yet have, or the coveting of things that we just can't have. And he says, you don't have because you never thought to ask for the people in your community, just to ask for it. This is not about how to pray and ask God for something. He says you don't have because you're not living harmoniously in your community. If you were living harmoniously in your community, then you could ask someone for help and they would say, oh yeah, we totally trust you. We're totally going to give you whatever you need. We're going to help you. We're going to be there. So this isn't about getting your personal requests for power and pleasure and comforts from God, like some kind of magic wand, and then bam, and then God answers your prayer. This isn't a formula for that. It's about how to live in community with each other in a way, because people here lived hand to mouth. 90% of the people were dirt poor, and they didn't know where their next bread was coming from, most likely. So, like, you don't have something because you're not living in community with each other enough to earn their trust to ask for help. And then they were like, yeah, we're going to help you, because the next verse says you didn't, or maybe you did ask and you didn't receive because you asked wrongly in order to spend it on your pleasures. So, you're asking for help from somebody, but they know that you're just going to take that help and you're going to go squander it on something, or you're going to turn it on somebody, or you're going to use it for some kind of selfish something. And they're like, I don't know if we can trust Billy Joe Bob with, giving him, this thing that he says he needs, because what is he going to do with it? Might turn on us. Or you've sought it in violence because it's, you didn't have it, so you murdered somebody. You went and you took something violently from somebody, and then it's like, oh, we don't trust so and so because they are like manipulative or dominating or violent or angry or something. But if we were living at peace with those around us, it wouldn't happen that way. You wouldn't have needs because you could just ask people for help and they would come and help you. Then he goes on to use a strong word. He says adulterers, which is a big word in the Jewish vocabulary of this time, of people who were not following God. In the Old Testament, that was the term. They were cheating on God, kind of a thing. So it's bringing light to that whole Old Testament history of calling the people cheaters. Then he says, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God. So he calls them cheaters. He's like, you're buddying up with power. That's a surefire way to be antithesis to what God is about, because God is about giving, and God is about generosity, and God is about like open-handed living. And if we are constantly grasping, and it's not about communal generosity, but getting for myself at the expense of another person, then we have turned ourselves against the very Spirit of God, because he goes on to say that the Spirit of, do you suppose that the Scripture speaks to no purpose? Does the Spirit that God caused to dwell in us desire envy? But God gives all the more grace. Therefore it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So this whole proud versus humble kind of a thing, the arrogant think they are better than themselves. They overestimate their means and their merits and their intentions. Versus the lowly, he says here, the lowly or the humble, means they're probably grief-stricken and depressed is the word for that. Grief-stricken and depressed. And so here's my little interpretation of verses 1 through 4. All of these conflicts among you, what is their source? They often come from our own inner wars of desire for comfort and power to maintain that comfort. We want something we don't have, so we violently pursue it. Or we are consumed by desire for something we cannot have, so we manipulate others to try and get it. We never thought to just humbly ask, probably because our reputation is stained by squandering what we get on our own selfish pleasures. We cheat on God when we live this way, buddying up to abusive power systems for its benefits. Buddying up. This is a weird sentence. Buddying up to abusive power systems for its benefits is to be opposed to God. God's spirit within us and the spirit of envy cannot occupy the same space. Therefore, those who arrogantly raise themselves above another naturally put themselves in opposition to God, while those who are lowly are more naturally positioned to align themselves with God. So, align with this natural law of God and oppose the spirit of judgmental slander. That is that whole submit yourselves to God and resist the devil and he will flee from you. The devil there is an interesting phrase. We have a whole theology from this point on till now of theological work we've done on who is the devil, but they only have like this part over here. So we read into it all the theology we've come to, but what they were talking about, the devil was an adjective actually. The word devil is not a proper noun or a noun, but an adjective, and it means the accusing one or the slanderer. And then it became personified over time and then became a proper noun, but it still was an adjective. It's kind of like how Google is a noun, but to Google something is a verb, and it's like it means both things. There was a theology that developed in the intertestamental period that then personified this person called the devil and made it as the person opposing God. But in this context, the devil is an adjective turned proper noun that means the spirit of judgmental slander. And it says if you oppose this spirit and all of its goals, then it retreats from you, because it's like to be aligned with God is to walk this way on the way, and then to be aligned with pride and accumulation of power is to walk this way, or the opposite way. And it says you need to align yourselves and go the direction that God's going. So the word there, submit yourself to God, is actually a military term. It means to fall in rank behind your commanding officer. And it's also a non-military term to voluntarily cooperate to carry a heavy burden. So if you've ever been asked to help a friend move before, then you have submitted in this terminology. So it says here, align with this natural law of God and oppose the spirit of judgmental slander. It will happen, and God will come close to you. Draw near to God, and God draws near to you, kind of a thing. So that is my revamping of this passage. Hope that it was non-fundy for you, and Unfundamentalist Bible study that you can kind of use to read about this book of James and take it out of its fundy passages and put it back into a context that matters for your life today, and not so religious, but more in where we are. So I'll stop talking now. You've listened far enough. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Unfundamentalist Bible Studies. And I hope you stay tuned for next week, where we finish up the book of James with a passage out of chapter 5, verses 13 through 20. I'm studying that right now, and I'll get back with you. So peace out. Talk to you later.